Most people think the deadliest families in America live in cities. They're wrong. Hidden in Appalachian hollows are bloodlines so violent that even hardened criminals won't cross into their territory. But here's what's truly disturbing. You've been driving past them your whole life. Deep in the hollers and ridges of Appalachia, where morning mist clings to mountainsides like secrets, families lived by rules that city folks would never understand. These weren't the kinds of disputes you'd settle in court or hash out over Sunday dinner. Mountain justice ran deeper than that. Blood deeper. When your nearest neighbor lived 3 miles away and the sheriff might as well have been on the moon, you handled problems yourself. That's just how it was. But what started as simple disagreements over property lines or livestock had a nasty habit of growing into something much darker. Something that could swallow entire generations whole. Land was everything in these mountains, not just for farming, mind you, but for dignity, for survival. A family's worth got measured in acres owned, creek frontage secured, and timber claimed. When boundaries blurred or deeds went missing, tempers flared hotter than a blacksmith's forge. One disputed fence post could spark a war that lasted decades. The thing about mountain families, they had long memories. Longer than most folks could imagine. A Hatfield would remember what a McCoy did in 1865 and still be planning payback in 1885. Mothers would rock their babies to sleep with lullabies about which families couldn't be trusted. Children learned to shoot before they learned their letters, and they learned who to shoot at before either. Then there's the matter of pride. Mountain pride wasn't just stubborn, it was volcanic. A man's reputation meant more than his bank account, assuming he had one. Call someone a liar in front of witnesses, and you'd better be ready for consequences. Cheat a neighbor out of $1, and you might find your barn mysteriously catching fire. Insult a mountain woman, and her brothers would come calling with more than harsh words. Isolated valleys became kingdoms unto themselves, each ruled by the strongest family. No outside law could reach every hollow or ridge. Makes sense, right? When you're 2 days' ride from the county seat and winter snows block the passes, you make your own rules. These mountain clans developed their own courts, their own punishments, their own twisted sense of justice. What outsiders never grasped was how these feuds became family traditions. Like passing down grandma's wedding ring or daddy's hunting rifle, revenge got handed from father to son, mother to daughter. A boy would grow up hearing stories about how the Johnsons killed his uncle in '72, and by the time he could hold a gun steady, settling that score felt like a sacred duty. Churches, surprisingly, didn't always help matters. Different families often belonged to different congregations, and when Sunday sermons started preaching about divine retribution, some folks took those lessons a little too personally. Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord, but plenty of mountain families figured they were just God's instruments on earth. The weird part is how normal it all seemed to the people living it. Children played in yards where shootouts had happened. Women hung laundry on lines that provided cover during ambushes. Men would tip their hats politely to sworn enemies at the general store, knowing full well they might be shooting at each other come nightfall. It was a dance everyone knew the steps to. Feuding families developed elaborate codes and customs around their violence. There were rules about who could be targeted and when. Some clans wouldn't harm women or children. Others showed no such mercy. Certain locations like churches or cemeteries might be considered neutral ground, or they might be seen as perfect spots for an ambush, depending on the family's particular brand of honor. Let's not forget how geography played into these conflicts. Dense forests provided perfect cover for bushwhackers, winding mountain roads created ideal spots for ambushes. Creek beds offered escape routes that outsiders couldn't follow. The land itself became a weapon, and families who knew every ridge and hollow held deadly advantages over their enemies. What really made these feuds different from garden-variety violence was their generational nature. This wasn't crime, it was inheritance. A 10-year-old boy would watch his father get gunned down and spend the next 20 years planning revenge. When he finally got it, the dead man's son would take up the cause. Round and round it went, like some hellish family tradition that nobody could break. The most dangerous families understood something that law enforcement never quite grasped in the mountains. Reputation was everything. Word of a clan's ruthlessness would spread from valley to valley, carried by traveling merchants and wandering preachers. Fear became currency. The bloodier your reputation, the less likely other families were to cross you. But here's where the story gets really dark. While history books love talking about the famous feuds, the Hatfields and McCoys, the Rowan County War, they'd barely scratch the surface of mountain violence. The deadliest clans operated in shadows so deep that their names never made newspaper headlines. Their victims disappeared without traces, their crimes went unreported and unpunished. Among these forgotten families, some achieved levels of brutality that would make your blood run cold. Take the Barnard-Sutton rivalry, which started in a place you'd least expect violence to erupt. The Barnard-Sutton feud started in a place most people consider holy ground, a church. But this wasn't your typical Sunday morning service gone wrong. This was mountain justice meeting God's house, and the results were absolutely brutal. Picture rural Kentucky in the 1800s. Families lived by their own rules, settled their own disputes, and trusted their neighbors about as much as they'd trust a rattlesnake in their boot. The Barnards and Suttons had been eyeing each other suspiciously for years, but nobody expected things to explode quite like they did. The trouble began when both families claimed the same piece of bottom land near the creek. Good farmland was scarce in those hills, and both clans needed it to survive. But here's where it gets interesting. Instead of taking it to court like civilized folks, they decided to hash it out during church service. Yes, you heard that right. They brought their land dispute to the Lord's house, and the Lord apparently wasn't in a peaceful mood that day. What started as heated words during prayer meeting quickly turned into something much darker. The Barnard patriarch, Old Man Samuel, stood up right there in the wooden pews and called out Jim Sutton for being a land-grabbing snake. Jim didn't take too kindly to that accusation, especially not in front of half the county. He stood up, pointed his weathered finger at Samuel, and declared that any Barnard who set foot on his land would meet their maker real quick. Well, that threat didn't sit well with the Barnard boys. The following Sunday, both families showed up to church again. But this time, they came prepared for more than just singing hymns. The tension in that little wooden chapel was thicker than mountain fog. Women clutched their children closer. Men kept their hands near their coat pockets. Everyone knew something was about to happen, but nobody expected it to be that violent. During the middle of the sermon, Samuel Barnard suddenly stood up and pulled out his pistol. Before anyone could blink, Jim Sutton was reaching for his own weapon. The two patriarchs faced each other across those church pews like gunslingers in some twisted Western movie. Except this wasn't entertainment. This was mountain fury about to explode. They fired simultaneously. Both men dropped dead right there in the sanctuary, their blood staining the wooden floors where people had been kneeling in prayer just minutes before. The congregation scattered like startled deer, women screaming, children crying, and the preacher diving behind his pulpit for cover. Two family leaders had just killed each other in God's house, and everybody knew this was just the beginning. The weird part is how quickly the violence spread after that. You'd think two dead patriarchs might end the feud, but mountain logic doesn't work that way. The surviving Barnards blamed the Suttons for starting the whole mess. The remaining Suttons swore the Barnards had planned the church ambush all along. Instead of grief bringing them together, it tore them further apart. What followed was 20 years of pure hell in that Kentucky valley. Sons avenged fathers. Cousins hunted cousins. Innocent family members got caught in crossfires they never wanted any part of. Barns mysteriously burned down. Livestock turned up dead. People started traveling in groups and carrying weapons everywhere they went. The violence became so routine that locals developed their own twisted sense of humor about it. They'd joke about which family would lose someone next, or place bets on whether the Barnards or Suttons would strike first each month. Dark humor was sometimes the only way mountain folks could cope with living in a war zone. Then there were the night raids. Both sides would sneak around in the darkness, taking shots at each other's houses, leaving threatening messages, or worse. Children grew up sleeping with one eye open, never knowing if they'd wake up to gunfire or screaming. Some families moved away entirely, but most stayed and endured because leaving meant abandoning everything they'd ever known. Local law enforcement, they basically gave up trying to intervene. County sheriffs knew that getting between feuding mountain families was a quick way to end up dead themselves. So they let the Barnards and Suttons settle their own scores, no matter how bloody things got. The strangest thing about this whole feud is how little anyone outside the region ever heard about it. While the Hatfields and McCoys were making national headlines, the Barnard-Sutton War was claiming just as many lives with barely a whisper in the newspapers. Mountain folks kept their business to themselves, even when that business involved decades of killing. But the Barnards and Suttons weren't the only families keeping deadly secrets in those hills. Some mountain clans had even darker stories to tell, and some of those stories involved women who made the feuding men look like choir boys in comparison. After families like the Barnards and Suttons turned churches into battlegrounds, you might think mountain violence couldn't get worse. Well, you'd be wrong. Dead wrong. Meet Permelia Warren, a woman whose name still makes old-timers in Kentucky lower their voices. She didn't just kill people, she orchestrated massacres that made grown men afraid to sleep without barricaded doors. Her story starts with something as simple as market prices, but it ends in a bloodbath that changed how mountain families saw revenge forever. The year was 1878, and Permelia lived in the rugged hills of eastern Kentucky where cash money was scarce and every penny mattered. Like most mountain folk, she depended on trading goods at local markets to survive. But when a dispute erupted over the price of her goods, something that should have been settled with harsh words and maybe a shove, Permelia decided the offense demanded blood. Not just any blood, mind you, she wanted complete destruction. Here's where things get truly dark. Permelia didn't go after the man who'd wronged her directly. That would have been too clean, too simple for her twisted sense of justice. Instead, she gathered a gang of willing accomplices and planned something that would haunt the mountains for decades. She targeted the man's entire family while they slept, including his wife, children, and even the hired help. The attack came on a moonless night, when the family felt safest in their isolated cabin. Permelia's gang surrounded the house like wolves circling wounded prey. They didn't want money or valuables, they left everything untouched except for lives. When dawn broke, 8 people lay dead, a mother trying to shield her babies, a young nanny barely out of childhood herself, and 6 children whose only crime was being born into the wrong family at the wrong time. But wait, it gets worse. The killers didn't just murder and leave. They arranged the bodies in deliberate positions, sending a message that anyone who crossed Permelia Warren would face the same fate. The brutality was so complete, so methodical, that even hardened mountain men who'd seen their share of feuding violence stood slack-jawed at the scene. Word of the massacre spread through the hollows faster than wildfire in dry timber. Mothers started sleeping with loaded rifles beside their beds. Fathers began teaching their sons to shoot before they could properly hold the guns. The unwritten rules of mountain feuding, rules that usually protected women and children, had been shattered like glass on stone. Then there's the aftermath, which might be even more chilling than the murders themselves. Permelia didn't hide or run to distant states like most killers. She stayed right there in the mountains, living openly while fear of her spread through dozens of communities. People whispered that she kept a list of other families who'd wronged her, checking off names as she pleased. Whether that was true didn't matter. The terror was real enough. Local law enforcement, they were either too scared or too corrupted to touch her. Some say she had family connections protecting her. Others claim her gang was too well armed and organized for the sparse mountain lawmen to handle. The truth probably lies somewhere between both explanations, mixed with the simple fact that mountain justice operated by different rules than town law. What made Permelia's reign of terror especially effective was her patience. She didn't strike randomly or in fits of rage like most mountain killers. She planned, waited, and chose her moments with the cold calculation of a chess master. Families never knew if they were safe or if they'd somehow ended up on her invisible list of enemies. The Warren massacre became a turning point in how Appalachian feuds operated. Before Permelia, most family conflicts followed certain unspoken boundaries. You might kill the man who wronged you, maybe his brothers, but you generally left wives and babies alone. After her bloody example, those boundaries crumbled. Feuding families realized that total warfare was now on the table, and many embraced it with terrifying enthusiasm. Years passed before Permelia's reign of fear finally ended, though exactly how varies depending on who tells the story. Some say rival families eventually banded together to eliminate her. Others claim she simply disappeared into the deep mountains, taking her secrets with her. A few old-timers swear she died naturally in her bed, surrounded by grandchildren who never knew the full extent of her crimes. The scary part? Permelia Warren wasn't unique. She was just the most successful at what several mountain families were already attempting. Her methods inspired copycats and imitators throughout the region, each trying to establish their own kingdoms of fear through calculated brutality. Speaking of calculated brutality, the Adair brothers took a different approach entirely. Where Permelia killed for twisted revenge, they murdered for something far more disturbing, pure pleasure. Midnight raids weren't uncommon in the Kentucky mountains, but what happened to the Baker family on that October night in 1897 went far beyond anything the Hills had seen before. The Adair brothers, Tom and Jake, weren't settling scores or collecting debts. They killed for sport. The Baker cabin sat tucked in a hollow near Hazard, Kentucky. Samuel Baker had built a decent life for himself as a small merchant, trading goods between mountain communities. He wasn't wealthy, but comfortable enough. His wife Polly had just given birth to their sixth child 3 weeks earlier. The house buzzed with the gentle chaos of a large family, children ranging from 2 to 14, all sleeping soundly when the brothers arrived. Tom and Jake Adair had earned reputations as drifters and troublemakers. They moved through Appalachian communities like wolves, taking what they wanted and moving on. But they'd never been suspected of murder. That was about to change in the most brutal way possible. Around 2 in the morning, the brothers forced their way through the Baker's front door. Samuel woke first, grabbing for the shotgun he kept beside the bed. He never got the chance to use it. Tom Adair's knife found his throat before he could even sit up properly. Polly screamed, clutching her newborn to her chest as Jake's pistol swung toward her. What happened next defied all logic. The brothers had broken in expecting to find money or valuables. Instead, they found a family that barely had enough to get by. A reasonable criminal would have left disappointed. The Adair brothers chose violence instead. They methodically went through the house, killing each of Samuel and Polly's children. The oldest boy, Matthew, tried to protect his younger siblings. He died first. Little Sarah, barely 4 years old, hid under her bed. It didn't matter. The brothers dragged her out and shot her anyway. One by one, 6 children lost their lives to men who gained absolutely nothing from their deaths. Then came the moment that would haunt Polly Baker for the rest of her life. Jake Adair pressed his gun against her temple while she held her infant son. "Your turn," he whispered. But as he pulled the trigger, Tom knocked into him, arguing over something they'd spotted in the bedroom. The bullet went wide, shattering a lamp instead. The lamp's burning oil splashed across Polly's dress, setting it ablaze. She screamed again, but this time it worked in her favor. The brothers, startled by the sudden fire and her panicked movements, stepped back. Polly rolled across the floor, smothering the flames while shielding her baby. In the confusion and smoke, she managed to crawl toward a back window her husband had built as an emergency exit. The weird part is what happened next. Instead of chasing her, the Adair brothers just stopped. They stood in a house full of bodies, surrounded by smoke and chaos, and seemed to lose interest entirely. They ransacked a few drawers, found maybe $3 in coins, and walked out into the night like nothing had happened. Polly Baker stumbled through the darkness for nearly 2 miles before reaching her nearest neighbor. Her dress was burned, her body cut from broken glass, but she and her infant son were alive. When the sheriff and his men reached the Baker cabin at sunrise, they found a scene that left grown men weeping. The manhunt for Tom and Jake Adair became one of the largest in Kentucky history. Wanted posters appeared from Virginia to Tennessee. Rewards climbed higher each week. But the brothers had vanished completely, swallowed by the endless maze of mountain paths and hidden valleys that made perfect hideouts for men who knew the terrain. Local families started sleeping in shifts. Mothers moved their children into single rooms where they could watch them better. Men formed informal patrols, walking property lines with loaded rifles. The fear wasn't just about the Adair brothers, it was about what their crime represented. If 2 men could murder an entire family for no reason and simply disappear, who was safe? Stories about that night grew with each telling. Some claimed the brothers were devil worshippers who killed for ritual purposes. Others insisted they were part of a larger gang terrorizing multiple states. The truth was somehow worse. They were just 2 men who discovered they enjoyed killing and decided to act on that impulse. Polly Baker eventually moved away from Kentucky, taking her surviving son to live with relatives in Ohio. She never spoke publicly about what happened, but family members said she never slept through the night again. Every sound, every shadow brought back that October evening when evil walked through her front door wearing human faces. The Adair brothers' trail went completely cold within months. Unlike other mountain killers who left patterns or clues, Tom and Jake seemed to dissolve into legend. But their crime opened something dark in those hills, a realization that some family feuds and vendettas could spiral into violence that made the Adairs look almost tame by comparison. Jim Wright stared at his father's grave with murder in his heart. The headstone told only half the story, that Samuel Wright died in 1898. What it didn't mention was the bullet that killed him, or the man who fired it. 300 miles away in another state, John Templeton was having the same dark thoughts about his own dead father. Two young men, two fresh graves, two burning desires for revenge that would soon merge into something far more terrifying than either could have imagined alone. The Wright and Templeton families had been friends for years, bonded by shared tragedy and a simple belief: when someone kills your kin, you kill them back. Makes sense, right? Well, it made perfect sense to Jim and John. They shook hands over their father's graves and made a pact that would turn them into the most feared killers in 3 states. Their first target was easy to find. The man who shot Samuel Wright lived just 2 counties over, probably thinking he was safe because some time had passed. He wasn't. Jim Wright put a bullet through his kitchen window on a Tuesday morning while the man was eating breakfast. 1 down. John Templeton's revenge came next, but his father's killer had friends who tried to protect him. That didn't work out too well for anyone involved. By the time John was finished, 3 men lay dead in a barn outside of town. The blood debt was growing. Here's where things get interesting and terrifying. Most feuds stayed local, but Jim and John decided to take their show on the road. They crossed state lines like they were taking a Sunday stroll, leaving bodies in Kentucky, Tennessee, and Virginia. The law back then wasn't exactly equipped to handle criminals who treated state borders like suggestions. The official count reached 19 victims within 2 years. 19. But locals whispered the real number was much higher, maybe twice that. Some deaths never got reported, especially when they happened in remote mountain areas where the nearest sheriff was days away. Families would bury their dead and keep their mouths shut rather than risk drawing more attention from the Wright Templeton gang. Their methods were brutal and efficient. No fancy plans or elaborate schemes, just cold-blooded murder, followed by a quick escape into familiar mountain terrain. They knew every ridge, every hollow, every cave where a man could disappear for weeks. The mountains protected them like a mother shields her children. Word spread faster than wildfire. Mothers would hush their children with warnings about the Wright Templeton gang. Shopkeepers would close early when strangers rode into town. Even other outlaws gave them a wide berth. These weren't robbers or cattle thieves. They were something darker, something that killed for reasons most people couldn't understand. The weird part is how they justified everything. In their minds, they weren't murderers. They were sons honoring their fathers. Every killing was connected to that original blood debt, even when the connections got pretty thin. Kill a man's brother, and his cousins become targets. Kill the cousins, and their friends get marked for death. The circle kept growing. Law enforcement tried everything. Bounty hunters tracked them through 3 states. Sheriffs organized pauses that combed the mountains for months. Nothing worked. Jim and John knew the terrain too well, and they had too many friends and relatives willing to hide them. Then there were the rewards. By 1901, the combined bounty on their heads reached amounts that made grown men quit their jobs to become manhunters. Thousands of dollars, enough money to buy a farm and live comfortably for years. Yet somehow these 2 killers kept slipping away. But here's the thing about blood feuds: they never really end, they just change direction. The same violence that made Jim Wright and John Templeton famous eventually caught up with them. Wright died in a shootout with a posse in 1902, riddled with so many bullets that the undertaker had trouble preparing his body for burial. Templeton lasted another year before a rival gang cornered him in a cabin and burned it down with him inside. When news broke that both men were finally dead, something unprecedented happened. Thousands of people traveled from across the region just to see their bodies. The crowds were so large that local authorities had to post armed guards around the morgues. People wanted proof that the nightmare was really over. Their deaths marked the end of one of the bloodiest chapters in Appalachian history. But the violence they unleashed didn't just disappear. Other families had watched. Other families had learned. The Wright Templeton methods would be copied, refined, and passed down like deadly family recipes. Of course, these 2 weren't the only ones perfecting the art of mountain terror. Some families didn't just produce individual killers. They controlled entire counties through fear and violence, turning local government into their personal weapon. The Wright and Templeton gang's reign of terror was brutal, but it was nothing compared to what happened in Bledsoe County, Tennessee. While other feuding families fought over land or honor, the Tollett family turned violence into a business model. They didn't just kill their enemies, they built an empire on fear. Bloody Bledsoe County earned its nickname the hard way. The Tolletts made sure of that. For decades, this family controlled everything that mattered in their corner of Appalachia. Moonshine operations? Theirs? Local politics? Bought and paid for? Justice? Well, that was whatever the Tollets said it was on any given day. The family patriarch set the tone early: cross a Tollet and you didn't get a second chance. Their code was simple: an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, and if you couldn't pay in kind, you paid with your life. No appeals, no mercy, no exceptions. What made the Tollets different from other feuding clans was their organization. They weren't just hot-headed mountain folks settling scores with shotguns. These people ran their territory like a criminal enterprise, decades before anyone had heard of organized crime families in places like Chicago or New York. Local sheriffs knew better than to investigate Tollet business too closely. Judges found reasons to dismiss cases against family members. Witnesses had a strange habit of forgetting what they'd seen or simply disappearing altogether. The family didn't just use violence, they weaponized the entire justice system. Then there were the henchmen. The Tollets were smart enough to keep their own hands relatively clean by hiring others to do their dirtiest work. Desperate men, drifters, and local toughs all found employment in the Tollet organization. These hired guns carried out beatings, intimidation, and worse. Much worse. One particularly brutal incident involved a storekeeper who refused to stock Tollet moonshine exclusively. The man thought his established business and community connections would protect him. He was wrong. 3 days after his refusal, the store burned down. The storekeeper's body was found in the ashes, but the official cause of death was listed as an accident. Funny how accidents like that kept happening to people who opposed the family. The Tollets understood something other feuding families missed: control the money, control the power. Their moonshine operation wasn't just about making liquor, it was about creating dependence. Local businesses relied on Tollet customers. Politicians needed Tollet votes. Even preachers found their collection plates lighter when they spoke against the family's activities. But the real genius of their operation was psychological warfare. The Tollets didn't need to kill everyone who opposed them. They just needed to kill enough people, in creative enough ways, that everyone else got the message. A body found hanging from a bridge sent a clearer signal than a dozen legal threats. Local families learned to navigate Tollet rules like they were natural laws. You didn't speak against them in public. You didn't compete with their businesses. You definitely didn't court their enemies or testify against their interests. Break these unwritten rules, and you might wake up to find your barn burned, your livestock poisoned, or worse, you might not wake up at all. The strangest part? Many locals actually defended the Tollet system. Sure, it was violent, but it was predictable. Follow their rules, and you could live peacefully. The family provided jobs, protected their territory from outside threats, and settled disputes quickly. Their version of frontier justice was brutal, but it was also efficient. Government officials from outside Bledsoe County occasionally tried to investigate or intervene. These efforts usually ended in frustration. Witnesses wouldn't talk. Evidence disappeared. Sometimes the investigators themselves received subtle warnings about the dangers of mountain roads and hunting accidents. The Tollet Empire lasted longer than most feuding families because they adapted. When Prohibition ended and the moonshine business declined, they moved into other ventures: gambling, protection services, political influence, whatever paid well and kept them in power. They understood that successful criminals evolve with the times. Their downfall, when it finally came, wasn't due to law enforcement or rival families. Like many criminal enterprises, the Tollets were eventually destroyed by their own success and internal conflicts. Younger family members wanted bigger territories and faster profits. The careful balance of fear and respect that had sustained their power for decades began to crack. Yet even today, older residents of Bledsoe County sometimes speak carefully about the Tollet years. Not with nostalgia, exactly, but with a kind of resigned respect for their efficiency. The family proved that in isolated mountain communities, organized violence could be more effective than legal authority. The Tollets weren't the only ones who understood this principle. Across Appalachia, other families watched and learned from their success. Some of these students were even more dangerous because they combined Tollet-style organization with something the Tennessee family had always lacked: female leadership that was twice as ruthless and 3 times as clever. The mountains had a saying: never cross a mountain, mama. Turns out they weren't talking about bedtime stories and warm cookies. When most people think of Appalachian feuds, they picture bearded men with rifles settling scores behind old barns. But here's what the history books won't tell you. Some of the most feared clan leaders wore long dresses and cooked Sunday dinner between ordering executions. These weren't your typical frontier women. They ran criminal empires with the efficiency of a Fortune 500 company and the ruthlessness of a cartel boss. Take Sarah Iron Skirt McCready, who controlled 3 counties in eastern Kentucky during the 1880s. Her husband died young, leaving her with 7 sons and a moonshine operation that fed half the region. When rival families tried to muscle in on her territory, Sarah didn't just fight back, she eliminated the competition entirely. She'd invite enemy clan leaders to peace talks at her kitchen table, serving them her famous apple pie. The arsenic was her own special ingredient. The woman had a system that would make modern crime families jealous. Each of her sons controlled a different aspect of the business. One handled distribution, another managed the stills, a third dealt with law enforcement bribes. Sarah kept the books and made the big decisions. Cross her family, and you'd wake up to find your barn mysteriously burned down. Cross her twice, and you wouldn't wake up at all. But Sarah was practically a saint compared to Black Betty Tolbert, who ran the nastiest stretch of Tennessee backwoods like her personal kingdom. Betty inherited leadership after her father and 3 brothers died in a single shootout. Instead of stepping aside for male cousins, she grabbed power and never let go. Her method was simple, absolute fear. Betty's calling card was leaving a black ribbon tied to a tree branch outside her victims' homes. Find that ribbon, and you had exactly 24 hours to leave the county forever. Stay longer, and the Tolbert boys would come calling after midnight. The ribbon became so feared that grown men would pack their families and flee at the sight of black cloth fluttering in the wind. What made these mountain matriarchs so dangerous wasn't just their willingness to kill, it was their intelligence. They understood something their male counterparts often missed. Fear was more powerful than bullets. A dead enemy could become a martyr, but a terrified enemy told stories that kept others in line. Granny Delilah Hawkins perfected this approach in the Virginia hills. She never killed anyone herself, but her reputation for settling scores was legendary. Delilah would show up at church socials with a knitting bag full of techniques that would make medieval torturers proud. She'd sit in the front pew, needles clicking away, while everyone wondered who she was, knitting for next. The psychological warfare was brilliant and effective. These women also mastered the art of appearing respectable while running murder operations. They hosted quilting circles where they planned raids. They organized church fundraisers that were really money laundering schemes. They taught Sunday school while their sons buried bodies in the hollers. The perfect cover was hiding in plain sight, and mountain society's expectations of women made them nearly untouchable. Law enforcement struggled with female clan leaders in ways they never did with men. Arresting a respectable woman was social suicide for sheriffs who needed local support. Plus, these matriarchs were experts at maintaining plausible deniability. They never gave direct orders, just gentle suggestions about family honor and protecting the clan's reputation. The code of silence these women enforced was absolute. Family members who talked to outsiders didn't just face exile, they faced death. Neighbors who witnessed crimes suddenly developed convenient amnesia. Even decades later, mountain families would refuse to speak about certain women, as if saying their names might summon them back from the grave. Then there's the strangest part. Many of these deadly matriarchs were genuinely loved by their communities. They provided jobs through illegal operations, settled local disputes, and took care of widows and orphans. They were murderers and philanthropists, rolled into one terrifying package. Their influence shaped mountain culture in ways that lasted generations. The idea that family loyalty trumps everything else that came from these women. The belief that some things are better handled privately than through courts. Also their legacy. The suspicion of outside authority figures trying to interfere in local affairs. You can trace that straight back to the matriarchs who made their own rules and enforced them with blood. Modern Appalachian communities still carry traces of this matriarchal influence, though thankfully without the body count. But the lessons these women taught about family, loyalty, and never backing down from a fight, those teachings survived long after their guns went silent. And speaking of survival, these forgotten feuds didn't just disappear when the last shots were fired. Walk through any small Appalachian town today, and you might think those old feuds died with the last gunfighter. You'd be wrong. The bloodiest families from Kentucky's hidden past didn't just vanish into history books. They left something behind, invisible threads that still pull at mountain life in ways most people never notice. Take the simple act of choosing a mechanic or a grocery store. In some hollows, families still avoid certain businesses because their great-grandfather once crossed the wrong clan. Sounds silly? Maybe. But when your ancestors survived a midnight raid by the Adair brothers, you don't forget which side of the creek to stay on. These aren't dramatic Hollywood grudges anymore, they're quiet preferences passed down like recipes for cornbread. The famous code of silence that outsiders love to talk about, that didn't come from nowhere. When Permelia Warren's gang could murder entire families over market disputes, talking to the wrong person meant death. Families learned to keep their mouths shut, handle problems privately, and trust only blood relatives. 3 generations later, that same silence protects everything from moonshine operations to family scandals. The stakes changed, but the habit stuck. Local justice still carries echoes of those brutal family courts. Remember how the Tollets decided who lived or died in bloody Bledsoe County? Well, some mountain communities still prefer handling disputes among themselves rather than involving outside law. It's not always violent now, but the distrust of official authority runs deep. When your great-grandmother watched corrupt officials look the other way during massacres, you learned to solve problems without calling the sheriff. Then there's the matter of respect. Those iron-fisted matriarchs who ruled through fear created a culture where crossing certain families still feels dangerous, even when the danger is mostly memory. A descendant of the Wright gang might not shoot you for an insult, but the weight of that family name still carries power in local negotiations. People remember which bloodlines once controlled the mountains, but here's where it gets interesting. Some of these old feuding families actually became pillars of their communities. The same ruthless survival instincts that made them deadly also made them resilient. Families who once settled disputes with bullets learned to settle them with political influence, business deals, and social pressure. The violence faded, but the clan loyalty remained stronger than ever. Wedding guest lists in certain areas still reflect century-old alliances. Families that stood together against the Barnard-Sutton violence still intermarry and support each other's businesses. Meanwhile, descendants of rival clans might live in the same county for decades without ever really mixing socially. It's not hatred anymore, it's just the way things are. Local politics carry these invisible divisions too. Election day often splits along lines that make perfect sense to old-timers but confuse newcomers. Why does one hollow always vote against the other? Because their ancestors fought a 20-year war over church leadership and land rights. The specific issues died out, but the tribal thinking survived. Even the way people tell stories reflects this bloody past. Mountain families don't just share funny childhood memories. They pass down detailed accounts of who wronged whom, when, and why. These aren't bedtime stories. They're historical records that keep old boundaries alive. Children learn which families can be trusted and which ones require careful watching. The strangest part? Most of these families have forgotten exactly why they avoid each other. Ask someone why they don't do business with the Johnsons, and you might hear a vague story about trouble way back or something that happened to my grandfather. The specific crimes of the Adair brothers or the Tollett gang fade, but the wariness remains like a scar that's outlived its wound. Modern mountain communities aren't violent like their ancestors, but they're still shaped by those old patterns of loyalty, silence, and suspicion. A dispute over property lines might not end in murder anymore, but it could split a church congregation or divide a school board for years. The feuding spirit found quieter ways to express itself. What's really remarkable is how these forgotten families created social rules that still govern behavior today. The deadliest clans rarely made it into history textbooks, but their influence on mountain culture runs deeper than any famous feud. They taught entire regions how to handle conflict, who to trust, and when to keep quiet. The Hatfields and McCoys get all the attention, but the truly dangerous families operated in shadow. Their legacy isn't found in museums or documentaries, it lives in the unspoken rules that still guide daily life across Appalachia. Makes you wonder what other secrets these mountains are keeping, doesn't it?